Alright, after many problems in recording this video, we're here with my video on why Seto is the greatest triple triad player of all time. So he started playing on TTX, which was the site before TT Advance and TTV3, and after tripletriad.com. And he initially just flipped stuff. You know, he did the things all noobs do where you just capture cards and hope to win at the end. But eventually Dalamar sat him down and said, hey, this is not how to play. We can do more complicated things and win a lot more games. And he described this in an Occult Fan article as happening at the end of TTX. But I think it must have happened at least a little earlier, because a story Homer told me about Seto, when Seto was going by the name Inuyasha, also at the end of TTX, was Seto asked Homer, can we share accounts? And Homer agreed, and Homer wasn't very active at the time. He was going out of triple triad phases then, and when he'd log in, which was only occasional, he'd see suddenly the account has a lot more wins than it used to have, and barely any more losses. So I think Seto, as soon as he was shown there's more to the game than just flipping stuff, immediately caught on and started winning. And he's gonna, here he went by the name Inuyasha. There are gonna be a lot of names Seto went by. I believe he went by Cashew. I'm not entirely sure. There's an article saying Seto, the artist formerly known as Cashew. I assume that means he went by Cashew, Inuyasha, Sasuke, Vivi, Kurama, and of course Seto. I'll be calling him Seto, but in at least one of the tournament brackets we'll see he is listed as Kurama. So he comes to Triple Triad Advance. He names himself Seto after a Seto Kaiba from Yu-Gi-Oh!, which he used to be pretty addicted to. I always thought he named it after the FF7 character, but that was deeply incorrect. Most of his names were taken from various anime shows. In the first tournament ever, he made a quarterfinals, and then he made another quarterfinals in early 2005, and also was a strong clan member, and that would continue to be true throughout his career, is that he would really put an emphasis on clan tournaments and perform very well there, and he was part of the Clan Wars winning team in 2005 with Zodiac Braves. I generally have him rated 10th to 20th on the site over this time, which is of course quite good, but he will rise. In 2006, he starts having some really deep runs. He makes the semifinals of Eris, and then makes the finals of Triad Wars 4, beating players like Stuff, who's, I think, one of the early legends, Kefka, who I think is in the conversation for best player to never win a tournament, Bryce, who didn't play long on Triple Triad Advance, but she was excellent, and Tezuka, who's another person I think in the conversation for one of the best players to never win a tournament, and both times he lost to the eventual tournament winners, which were Sujiro and Virgil. He jumps up to being rated 2nd through 6th on the site at around a 2200 rating, a mark he will soon go way past, and is just clearly understood as this guy is an enormous threat to win tournaments. In March 2007, Solo said, Seto, surprisingly, has never won an official singles triple triad tournament. So in 2007, as we may recall, this was the huge year for Delial, but it was also a phenomenal year for Seto, who you might think had an even better year. Because Seto surpasses his finals in Triad Wars 4 by winning Triad Wars 5, as well as winning the first SE Rinoa to grab his first 2 titles, and become just the second player after Doc Evil to win 2 titles in the same year. The August 2007 Occult Fan panel, there might be a bunch of typos here. I tried to fix them, but I don't know why. I wrote this one really badly. It says Occult Fan. But the August 2007 Occult Fan panel voted him tied for best active player on the site with Kamikaze and someone else. Kamikaze described him as extraordinary player, and always has been. Kaus described him as arguably the most consistent player over the 5 years of TTA, and Seto described himself as, I think I'm fairly overrated, LOL. And something really constant through early interviews of Seto and Delial is both of them recognize that people see them as really top tier and don't necessarily see themselves that way, and clearly know they're good, but don't think they're necessarily top of the world, when I think they pretty clearly were. In 2008, Kamikaze said, at the moment, Seto appears to be unstoppable. In addition to both winning and retaining SE Rinoa, as if that wasn't good enough, he has also reached the finals of Triad Wars 6, meaning he could be the first player ever to win 2 Triad Wars crowns, and back-to-back at that. So he does lose the finals of Triad Wars 6 to Delial there, but that means he had 3 straight Triad Wars years of a finals, a win, and a finals, Triad Wars is arguably the most serious tournament on the site. It, unlike the site championship, doesn't have a closed component. Unlike the special edition tournaments, it is once a year rather than there are a lot more chances to win it. And to have this kind of run in Triad Wars is truly incredible. And spoilers, he won't play the next Triad Wars, but the one after that, he wins to become the first to ever win 2 of them. And also that means in 4 Triad Wars, he went finals win, which is just absurd. And he had the Rhinoa title, which was one where whoever won the next tournament would play you for that title, and the winner would get to keep the card. And he defeated Kana, Great Sephiroth, and Slash of Time, who are all multiple-time tournament winners. So this is a truly spectacular year for him, even if he didn't end up winning any further tournaments. 2009 is the worst year of Seto's career, and I think for some people could have been the end. Like Delial, he had an incredible 07-08 run, and like Delial, he dropped off a lot in 2009. Delial had a quarterfinal or 2, and Seto had just nothing this year at all. Early exits, inactivity, played 2 or 3 tournaments, and didn't get past round 2 in any of them. But due to his absurd past results, and due to the fact that when he lost, he did lose to very good players, he's still rated number 1 or number 2 the entire year. Actually, one of his losses is to Surante, which I think is the biggest upset of all time. But most of his losses are to very good players, as we'll get to later. So I think it's very obvious here. This is when I started playing well, and just Seto and Delial were the references you had for these are the 2 best players. And I wrote an article at around this time, I'm not sure it was exactly 2009, I couldn't actually find it, that argued Seto was the GOAT over Delial, Doc Evil, who we've talked about. Myself, I had just won 3 tournaments this year, so I entered the conversation, and others. I thought overall, Seto had the most impressive run. That what Kaus had said, if he's been the most consistent player over the 5 years of Triple Triad Advance, now we were up to 6 or 7, and I thought that was still the case. That you could look at a lot of numbers, and Seto was the GOAT. But 2009 was not the end for Seto, because while 2008 was his best year, 2010 was really strong as well. He wins Triad Wars 8, which I'll return to in a bit because I think it's a historic tournament, and he was part of the Clan Wars winning team Paradigm Shift. That's his second Clan Wars that I know of, but he may have easily won more I don't. Then he went inactive through 2011, only playing 1 tournament at the end, which he won, and he wins his 4th tournament, becoming the 2nd player to ever win 4 tournaments, as well as the 2nd fastest to win 4 tournaments, meaning he took the 2nd fewest tournaments played to reach his 4th tournament win. In 2012, he made the finals of the 10th Site Championship to close out his individual open career. But he also made a semifinals in a closed tournament after, where he lost to his arch-rival Delial. I think this is probably the only place I'm really going to talk about his closed play. But I remember every conversation about the best closed player I was ever part of. Seto was always mentioned, and often as the best closed player. And I know that's not how he thought of himself or what he prided himself on. But I do think that was a strength he had that may have even been as good as his open play, though obviously I think closed has a lower skill peak cap. But I do want to credit that I think he was a tremendous closed player, and I think that's, important. It's a real skill. Closed is not a joke. Closed is a very good game, and he was tremendous at it. He also, continues to just crush Clan League and Clan Wars. I don't know how many of the Brotherhood of Seed winning Clan Wars teams he was part of, but I assume he was in at least 1 or 2 of those, so adds another few Clan Wars to his resume. I know he won every single game he played in a Clan League, which is quite hard because ties count, so you have to win first game every time. The Brotherhood of Seed did not win the Clan League, where he won every game. I believe Elite Four did. You'll also notice here that Seto is relatively inactive for a top player. He goes in and out of playing tournaments. He did in 2009, but even in 2007 and 8, he was missing lots of tournaments too. And I think he's sort of interesting just personality-wise, because a lot of the other greats, Delial has said he wouldn't trade a moment of Triple Triad for the world. I was incredibly enthused about Triple Triad and remain so whenever I go into a Triple Triad phase. Yojimbo was very intense and maintained that for an incredible amount of time. Really impressive feat. And Seto, a lot of his quotes are very much, it's a way to pass the time. I think he took Triple Triad maybe a little less seriously, but also took it as, this is a game, and this is not something he was as invested in, I think, as some other players were. And it speaks to how good he was, but I also think that his going in and out of tournaments may have helped him. It both makes him look better in my ratings than perhaps it might, but more importantly, I think it avoided him burning out. I think he's someone who could have burned out and found a way to come in and out and maintain incredible strength, which is really hard to do when you're coming back from inactivity. So I don't think this is a criticism or anything, but I wanted to say that I think he's had a somewhat different perspective and connection with the game than a lot of other top players did. And I might be wrong on that because I might be reading into quotes and I don't know him well. But that was my impression. So here we have his tournament wins. I'm going to show 3 of them, not all 4. We'll get to the 4th later. But his first tournament win, he won Triad Wars 5. He beats Cookie in the first round. Cookie was quite possibly the best active player on the site at the time, so that's a huge win. Cookie had recently won 2 tournaments. He beats Rhinoa in the second round, Sachi in the third round. Gambit X, very solid player over his career in the 4th round. You'll notice Gambit X had just knocked out Turds, who's a very strong player, though Turds had not yet hit his prime. Then he defeats Daikon Entite, a fantastic player and eventual tournament winner in the semifinals, and Koops in the finals, who, quite a solid player. So that's his first win. And then his second win, I think, in Rhinoa was really impressive. He beats Jadat in round 2 and Piggyman in round 3, both really, really strong players. I'll probably be making a video about Piggyman at some point, but as you might notice in a moment, one of the problems with Piggyman's career is he kept playing Seto, and that was just a recipe for disaster. Beats Fipsmik and then Great Sephiroth in the semifinals. Great Sephiroth, obviously an incredibly good player. And then there was a 3-way finals, and he beat both Jaws and Sujiro to win the first Rhinoa. And then, as mentioned, he kept defeating other tournament winners to keep his title, defeating, I said Kana earlier, I've been told I'm supposed to say Kona, something like that. These videos, of course, remain misinformation on how to pronounce names, but defeats Kona in this, the second Rhinoa, defeats Great Sephiroth again in the third, and defeats Slash of Time in the fourth. And then in Ward, the tournament he won after taking all of 2011 off until the very end, you'll notice he's listed here as Karama. He beats Thea in the first round, and Thea was never a big name on the site, but if you look at his tournament results, they're very solid. Defeats the excellent Kana in round 2, defeats Emerald in round 3, also known as Broccoli or Rapid Assassin, and a 2-time tournament winner. She won her first tournament ever, then took like a 4-year break and won her first tournament back, which is ridiculous. Then Karama beat Raminator in the quarterfinals, who at this point was a very tough out. Beats Piggyman again in the semifinals, and beats Metis in the finals. Really nice run. Beating a lot of, strong opponents. And so those were 3 of his 4 wins. We'll get to his 4th. I think these are all good runs, and, he was facing tough opponents. So I'm going to talk a bit about his style, because I think it's both unique and quite interesting. So here's a long vid quote on Seto's style. Seto was pretty odd. I honestly never understood his hands. He loved hands that worked with a spot 5 starter. It always amazed me how many of those hands he could make in such little time, which led to another of his problems. He was stubborn as hell, too. Refused to believe that his hands were the cause for a loss when his hand was countered perfectly by someone else. Still, he was also really amazing at open in general. I think he had a really great understanding of game situations, and how he can turn the tide by abusing combo, setting up traps here and there. I've had a lot of times when I watch his games, he made a move, it seemed to be completely awful, and I expected him to lose now. His opponent played the move I predicted, and Seto won. Really, I just have no idea. Sorry. And I think this captures a lot of what he was good at, that he had this really good feel for combo. He set these really complex traps. I'm going to get to what I hope is a good example in a bit. And he would have a lot of situations that looked like they were disasters for him, and I felt the same watching him. Most of my time watching him was in 2008 before I got really strong, but this was very much my impression. He was someone I watched and I'd never predict the moves. It was very strange play to me. I think he did a few things. One is, I think at his core, he was a defensive player. I remember, in tournaments, he would make hands that used, for instance, Doom Train, an AA corner, and build around that corner being safe. But when those strong corners weren't working, he then was really phenomenal. And I think this is where he was so special and unique, at finding weak corners, easily capturable moves that set up everything to just work. All the numbers just come together really well, and he had this really wonderful feel for how to do so. And I think to do that, you have to be really good at calculating. As Vid said, he really abused the combo rule well. And I don't remember him ever losing a result once it reached the mid-late game, because I think he was just great at calculating. And I think that's really hard to do. I think even the best regularly, make some little error, don't think enough. And I think he was very strong in this department. So I'm going to give a couple examples from a game from a lecture I made. These are not games of Seto's. I just don't have the records. But I think it kind of captures the type of moves he was so good at finding. Weak corners or weak out-facing values that had just this powerful combo relevance and showed this is the square that's going to matter, and I'm going to fight for that square with complex moves and distance squares and really give my opponent difficulties. And I think he did this better than anyone else ever did. So in this position, blue is in a difficult situation. Red has secured the card in 1, has a hand with pretty powerful cards left, and blue's move is not obvious. I think most players would go in 3 or 7. I'm going to discuss 7 here. 3 is the better square to play in, but I'm going to discuss 7. And if you looked at this position, I told you have to go in 7. What card would you play there? And I think there's just an obvious answer. 7, 6, 3, 2, and 7 is safe. It cannot be captured. It captures a card. It seems to accomplish a lot. And I think most players will think, yep, that is the best move. I don't love it because my opponent can go in 5 and take stuff. I only have 1 safe card, but that's the best chance. But 7, 6, 3, 2, and 7 loses. And it loses to 6, 7, 2, 3, and 5. Red now has 2 cards that are basically locked for them. They have very powerful cards in the remaining direction to the left. They got to use their weakest card for the directionality of the game. They threaten a same in 8, so blue has to block. This is very easily and straightforwardly winning for red. I guess there's a couple tricky lines here, but they don't take too long to figure out. And, red wins easily. But a much trickier move for blue to play is 6, 3, 2, 7, and 7. And this looks kind of silly. It's capturable 2 ways. It doesn't seem to affect much. But if you understand, the key in this position is stopping that red move in 5, 6, 7, 2, 3. And all you want to do is stop that move. That's their most desirable move. That's the strongest card they can put in 5. 5 is the key square this position revolves around. Then you can start to find moves like this that have a weak out-facing value, but they can no longer play 6, 7, 2, 3, and 5 because bomb and 8 combos it. And it's actually quite hard to find wins for red here. Red is still winning, but it was this kind of move that... the score's listed wrong here, apologies. Should be 6-4 in blue's favor. But it was this kind of move that I think Seto was really good at finding. Instead of taking the safe, strong move when it didn't work, even if his bias, I think, was towards these safe defensive moves, he was so good at then saying, that doesn't work. What squares matter? What's my opponent's plan? And how can I set up combos against their plans? And that's why he made so many moves that I think Vid and I found incomprehensible, but ended up winning games because they set up these distant plans. And if you look at this position and try to find a win for red, and feel free to pause, I think once again, most players will think, okay, they'll check the moves in 5. If I tell you nothing wins in 5, there are 2 other options in 5, but I'll tell you, they don't actually win. I think where most players would look correctly next is 3. And the obvious move to play in 3 is 3, 2, 7, 6, and 3. But this does not win because our opponent can play 7, 6, 3, 2, and 5. Again, this all revolves around 5. So the winning move is actually 2, 6, 3, 6, and a 3, purely to set up combos against the opponent's move in 5. And again, I think this is what he did so well, was not taking the strong corner, but putting out weak numbers that set up enormous combo potential against the moves he understood because he knew which squares would matter the opponent wanted to play in. And this is my sense of his game. I might be wrong. Of course, I'm using examples not from his games. But to me, this feels like the kind of thing he did tremendously well and better than any other player, I think, to ever play. So how do you show someone's the best ever? I've said this over and over. I can't just list all the awesome things he did. I have to say why he did more, why he was better at things than everyone else was. And I also repeatedly list the problem with each player's case. So I have ratings for players based on ELO, which I think is a great rating system. You need to win over time to keep increasing your rating. A short-term span won't bring you to the top. You have to keep winning. You have to prove it over a length of time. It adjusts for strength of opponent. You beat higher-rated opponents, you get more points. You lose to lower-rated opponents, you lose more points. and he is the all-time leader for the longest time rated number 1 on the site, which of course is not a problem with his case. But if you do think Delial was better than him for any of the 2007-9 run, because Elo rates Seto as higher for the entirety of that run, then Seto's time atop the site drops dramatically, and he might drop down to 3rd or 4th longest number 1 on the site, depending on how much of that time you think Delial was better. And so, one problem with this case might be you think Elo overrates Seto's achievements as compared to Delial's, and thus you want to downgrade Seto a bit compared to where it puts him. The second downside, I think, is he has a losing record versus a lot of the other people who are in this conversation. He's 1-3 versus Delial, 1-4 if closed is included. He's 1-2 versus Yojimbo. He's 0-1 versus Was Up. A lot of his kind of, not necessarily contemporaries, because Delial only peaked at the same time he did, but a lot of the people in this conversation have favorable head-to-heads against him. And finally, while his win rates were incredibly high throughout, and on just about any win rate chart you come up with, he'll be ranked like 3rd all time, that's not 1st. And so others achieve slightly higher win rates in their best runs and for their career. And, there are people with just a bit higher win rates overall. And so I think these are the strongest cases against him as the GOAT. But the reason that I don't know if any of these qualms are particularly convincing is, he was rated number 1 longer than anyone else. And even if you take that away from him, even if you say, I'm not going to count, these 2 years of being number 1, he will still be ranked number 2 top 2 longer than anyone else, and ranked top 3, and top 4, and top 5, and it just keeps going. That he spent more time at the top, even if you say, okay, this part doesn't count, he will still be in those top spots just much longer than anyone else, and it's not close. We'll see the charts later. And while he has a relatively poor record against some of the best opponents, if you take his overall resume against other winners, other elite players, other good players, he just has a fantastic head-to-head set of records against players, and I think you'll be really impressed when we see it. And finally, on the note of others had higher win rates, he had the 2nd toughest tournament draws of anyone ever. I did a calculation of this once where I averaged the win percentage of every opponent you played over your career, and he was one of 2 players with harder, I believe, than 55% average opposition. Of course, the average opponent is 50%, and he had the 2nd toughest tournament runs of anyone. And so the fact that he put up this resume against such difficult a field, because I really think there's only one player that has a case to have had a tougher run. It really shows that, others may have higher win rates, but, Seto did it against harder opponents. So this is the final one of his tournament wins. I held off showing it till now, but let's look at it. In the first round, Seto beat the End, also known as Bren, more commonly known as Bren. In the second round, he beat Soli. In the third round, Yojimbo. In the fourth round, finally got a win over Delial. In the fifth round, Great Sephiroth. And in the sixth round, not shown here, MC. MC may seem like a slightly smaller name than the others, but MC in 2010 was absolutely ridiculous and arguably the strongest of those wins, even though the others are, of course, absurdly strong. So I think Triad Wars 8 is the greatest tournament ever won. And Seto did this after having had a really poor in and out 2009. He comes back and wins an incredible tournament. He defeated 5 winners in 6 rounds, which is just, again, speaks to how tough his paths often were, but also speaks to, it's really hard to beat that many good players. So he defeats Triad Wars 3 winner Bren, and then Soli, and then consecutively beating Yojimbo, Delial, Great Sephiroth, and MC. Is there a better 4-round run? And especially considering he won the tournament, it's just absurd. This is, I think, the best tournament win of all time. And it comes after Seto had an off year, and with him being relatively inactive, he still did this. It's just, one of the great achievements in Triple Triad history. So I talked about how Seto was rated higher longer than anyone. You can see by these charts, he's rated longest top 7 by a clear margin. He's rated longest top 5 by an even bigger margin. He's almost double as long, top 3 on the site, as any other player ever. And he spent the most time rated number 1. So if you like Elo, which I do, this just speaks to he was the best, and also he was one of the best far longer than any other player ever was. And if that's not a case for being the GOAT, I don't know what is. Also, Elo is relative. So if you take his final rating, it's the third highest ever. If you take the average rating over his time, it's the third highest average rating. If you take his peak rating, the highest rating he ever achieved, it's the third highest peak. And those are great numbers. But they do say, third. Third is not first. But he's arguably better than this looks, as rating tends to increase over time. And what rating should really be treated as is more a relative standing to your contemporary players. And so one way to look at it is Doc Evil had set a peak rating record, right? Doc Evil surpassed everyone, set a new record. Seto was the one to break Doc Evil's rating record. And how much did he break it by? How far was he ahead of the best achievements until his time? And then others later surpass his rating. But of course, if ratings get higher, you play higher rated opponents, and then your rating too can reach higher heights with similar win rates. So I think, as I said, a good way to look at this, or an interesting way to look at this, is how much ahead of prior records were you? And the person to beat the prior record by the most was Seto, 88 points ahead of Doc Evil's record. And then the incredible thing he did was after he lost the number one spot to Was Up and Great Sephiroth for like half a second, he reclaimed it and then rebroke the record and set it another 47 points higher. And the way I set up this list, it could only show your best time, your best achievement. But if he could be on this list twice, he would be on it first and fourth. That he surpassed what had been done before him by the most ever, and then again by the fourth most ever after having already done the prior. Just crazy, crazy achievement. So I talked about how he had some problems in his top matchups, but if you look at his win rates against different levels of opponents, he's 88% win rate versus weak players, where weak player is defined as a 45% or lower win rate, and that's a top 10 all-time win rate. But it's excellent, but it's not the tops. But against 45 to 65% strength opponents, which are very good players on the whole, note a 50% tournament player is a better than average player due to the way tournament fields work. Because if you lose, you are out immediately. So half the players in any tournament are just going to be 0-1 or 0%. A 50% player in any tournament is an above average performer. And so a 50% player overall will also, because they will play in more rounds, they will on average be playing people who are also above average performers, will have harder difficulty opposition than people that go out in the first round. So my point is 45 to 65% strength players are good players to very good players. And his 87% against them is second all time. And his 67% for 65+% opponents is also second all time. And if you just want him versus winners, he's 21-9 or 70%, which is also second all time. And the earlier chart showed him at 1-3 versus Delial, 1-2 versus Yojimbo, 0-1 versus Was Up. That's 6 of his all-time losses to winners right there. Against other winners, he lost 3 times total. So I think a fun chart is who he lost to. And I wouldn't normally bring this up because I don't, a list of who you lost to doesn't seem complimentary. But I think in this case, the list is so reliably strong players. Yes, there's Serante, and I think Serante beating Seto is the biggest upset of all time. Huge props to Serante. You might also think Fisto is probably the second weakest player on the list, but Fisto has some really big wins against good players. And after that, everyone there has made a finals or made a bunch of semifinals or won multiple tournaments. It is a very strong list. And I think there are only a few players, I listed them below, who can remotely compare to this kind of list of only losing to really good players and just not dropping random games and not dropping a lot of games to middling players. I think it's a really impressive list. So the case for Seto. No one was rated number one longer. What more do you need? That seems like enough to be the GOAT. And not only was he number one the longest, he was in the top few slots for far longer than anyone else. No one's close to that. He broke rating records by more than anyone else. He won the greatest, and as we said, he also broke rating records by the fourth most of all time. He won the greatest tournament ever won. I think Triad Wars 8 stands kind of alone. And maybe you could argue for some other cases if you looked at, okay, who was peaking at the time. But I think you just look at that tournament and it's pretty obvious that that's the best tournament. His win rates versus any level of opponent is superb. He was a just incredibly reliable player to win games. And I think he has this really unique and wonderful style that has no real comparable players and showed this deep understanding of both combo, but also what squares do I have to control by threatening potential combos down the road, and seeing how to do it is this really deep, profound understanding that's super cool. Some records he held. He was the longest time rated #1 on the site. He was also longest rated top 2, top 3, top 5, top 7. We've seen all this. He broke previous rating record by the biggest margin. He was the tied fastest to reach 4 finals, tied with Nightwish, meaning fewest tournaments played to reach your 4th final. He is the second highest win rate against medium and high level opponents. He also is the second highest win rate against tournament winners. He's the second player to win 4 tournaments and the second fastest by number of tournaments played to reach 4 wins. He's one of only 2 players to have 10 semifinals under his belt, and he is tied for 3rd, 4th all-time most tournaments won. And you'll note there are a lot of kind of seconds and thirds here and not that many firsts. But if you are second in a ton of categories and second to a different person each time, it can add up to this resume that equals, yes, he was the longest rated #1 of anyone ever. So, if you want the guy who is the best single tournament anyone's ever had, who is rated in the top spots longer than anyone has ever been rated in the top spots, who, just continually put up good result after good result, who beat really good opponents, beat bad opponents, beat great opponents, I think you'll agree, Seto is the greatest of all time.